Hey everyone, welcome back to Canadian Insights. So here's a sentence you probably never expected to hear. A former Conservative cabinet minister from the Stephen Harper era just wrote a love letter to Danielle Smith, and honestly, it might be the most interesting political plot twist of the week. We're talking about James Moore, who served under Harper and is now penning columns for CTV, coming out swinging with praise for Alberta's premier at a time when she's basically public enemy number one in British Columbia and facing criticism from multiple directions. But Moore's argument is actually pretty fascinating because he's essentially saying we spend so much time roasting politicians when they screw up that we forget to give them credit when they actually show leadership. So buckle up, because we're diving into why a Conservative heavyweight thinks Danielle Smith deserves applause, what this Memorandum of Understanding actually means, and whether Canadians are too quick to condemn and too slow to celebrate. Let's get into it. Alright, let's start with James Moore's opening thesis, because it's actually a pretty astute observation about Canadian political culture. Moore points out that we Canadians are, and I'm quoting here, an appropriately judgmental people when it comes to holding political leaders accountable. And honestly, he's not wrong. We are absolutely savage when politicians mess up. Whether it's a municipal councillor caught in a scandal, a provincial minister making a terrible call, or a prime minister breaking a campaign promise before the confetti from election night has even been vacuumed up, we come for them with the fury of 1,000 angry tweets. Our thumbs are blazing across smartphones faster than you can say accountability, and the court of public opinion delivers its verdicts in real time on social media. Moore says this is how it should be, and again, fair point. Democracy requires holding leaders accountable, and in the age of instant communication, that accountability happens at lightning speed. But here's where Moore flips the script and makes his really interesting argument. He says we need to do the inverse more often. When a leader actually rises to an occasion that demands reason, selflessness, or courage, we should recognize that leadership and maybe, just maybe, create a reward system that encourages more politicians to make good decisions. It's like positive reinforcement training, but for democracy. We're so good at punishing bad behavior that we've forgotten to acknowledge good behavior, and that might actually be creating perverse incentives. If politicians know they'll get destroyed for mistakes but receive radio silence for successes, why take risks? Why show leadership? Why compromise? Moore is essentially arguing that we need to celebrate political wins to encourage more of them, and that's what brings us to Danielle Smith. Now, before half of you click away because you saw Danielle Smith's name and immediately had strong feelings one way or another, hear me out, because Moore's actual argument about what she did is worth examining regardless of your political stripes. Last week, Smith signed the Canada-Alberta Memorandum of Understanding with Prime Minister Mark Carney, and Moore is calling this a significant act of leadership that deserves recognition. And look, I know what you're thinking. Danielle Smith? The same premier who just got blasted by David Eby for having secret pipeline conversations? The same Smith who's been at the center of federal-provincial tension for months? Yes, that Danielle Smith. But Moore's point is that this MOU represents a principled compromise that could actually move the needle on some of Canada's biggest economic challenges. So what's actually in this deal that has Moore so impressed? Let's break it down, because it's genuinely substantial stuff. First, there's modernizing the emissions cap on the oil sands to unlock large-scale investments in production. This is huge for Alberta because the oil sector has been operating under regulatory uncertainty that makes it really hard to plan major investments. If you're a company thinking about dropping billions into new production, you need to know what the rules are going to be. This MOU apparently provides some of that clarity. Second, there's pursuing nuclear power production to satisfy what Moore describes as skyrocketing energy demands on the horizon. And he's not wrong about those demands. Between data centers, AI infrastructure, electric vehicles, and everything else that needs power, we're looking at energy needs that are going to explode in the coming decades. But wait, there's more. The deal includes mandating Indigenous co-ownership and equity participation in projects. This is actually really significant because it moves beyond the old model of just consulting Indigenous communities and instead makes them actual economic partners with real ownership stakes. That's not just good politics, it's potentially transformative for Indigenous economic development. The MOU also involves shelving what Moore calls absurd electricity and emissions restrictions to open the door to AI data center agreements. Canada has been trying to attract major tech companies to build data centers here, and apparently some of the regulatory framework was making that basically impossible. If this deal actually clears those obstacles, we could be looking at major tech investment coming to Canada. Moore describes these compromises and reforms as vast in scope and deep in substance, and looking at the list, it's hard to disagree. This isn't some symbolic gesture or vague promise to work together better. This is concrete policy stuff that could actually reshape Alberta's economy and Canada's broader economic strategy. And here's the thing that Moore is really emphasizing. Smith didn't just demand everything Alberta wanted. She compromised. She worked with Carney, who let's remember is a Liberal Prime Minister, to find middle ground that advances Alberta's interests while also addressing federal concerns about emissions, Indigenous rights, and economic diversification. Now, Moore acknowledges that the way forward is enormously complex and fraught with challenges from those who will always say no to the energy sector. And that's putting it mildly. Environmental groups are going to oppose expanding oil production on principle. First Nations communities, particularly in BC, have serious concerns about pipelines and tanker traffic. There are legitimate questions about whether we should be making long-term investments in fossil fuel infrastructure when we're supposed to be transitioning to clean energy. These aren't trivial objections, and they're not going away just because Smith and Carney signed a piece of paper. But Moore's argument is aimed at what he calls moderate and open-minded Canadians who want to diversify our economy away from Donald Trump's America and who are open to responsible resource development. And that's actually a pretty large chunk of Canadians. Most people recognize that we need to reduce our economic dependence on the United States, especially with Trump back in the White House and tariff threats flying around. Most people also understand that Canada has valuable natural resources and that developing them responsibly could fund the transition to a cleaner economy. The question has always been how to do this in a way that balances economic development with environmental protection and Indigenous rights. Moore is arguing that this MOU represents real progress on that incredibly difficult balancing act. Here's what makes Moore's column particularly interesting from a political science perspective. He's a conservative praising a conservative premier for working with a Liberal Prime Minister to reach a major compromise. In our current era of hyper-partisan politics where crossing the aisle feels like committing treason, that's actually noteworthy. Moore isn't saying Smith sold out conservative principles or that Carney abandoned progressive values. He's saying they found middle ground that advances both provinces' interests and Canada's national interests. That's supposed to be how federalism works, but it happens so rarely these days that when it does happen, maybe we should actually acknowledge it. The nuclear power component of this deal deserves special attention because it represents a genuinely forward-thinking approach to energy policy. Nuclear energy is increasingly being recognized as essential for meeting climate goals while also powering energy-intensive industries. If Alberta can build out nuclear capacity, it could theoretically reduce emissions from the oil sands while also positioning itself as an energy superpower for the AI and tech sectors. That's not just incrementalism, that's potentially transformative economic strategy. The Indigenous co-ownership mandate is equally significant because it could reshape the entire model of resource development in Canada. Instead of the old pattern of companies extracting resources from Indigenous territories while communities get minimal economic benefit, this creates a framework where Indigenous peoples are actual owners with real stakes in project success. That aligns economic incentives in ways that could reduce conflict and create genuine prosperity in Indigenous communities. If this actually works, it could be a template for resource development across the country. Now, does all this mean we should just uncritically praise Danielle Smith and ignore the legitimate criticisms of her government? Of course not. Smith has made plenty of controversial decisions, and her handling of the pipeline discussions with BC deserves the criticism it received. But Moore's broader point about recognizing leadership when we see it is worth taking seriously. If we only ever punish politicians for failures and never acknowledge successes, we create an environment where taking risks and making compromises becomes politically dangerous. And in a country as regionally diverse and politically complex as Canada, we desperately need leaders who are willing to compromise. If you're enjoying our takes on the nuances of Canadian politics that go beyond simple partisan cheerleading, hit that subscribe button and join the Canadian Insights community where we post multiple videos daily breaking down the stories that matter. Drop a comment telling me whether you think Moore is right that we should celebrate this deal or whether you think the criticisms of Smith outweigh any positives from this memorandum. Smash that like button if you appreciate analysis that actually examines what's in these agreements instead of just tribal political reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one where we'll continue making sense of the beautiful chaos that is Canadian politics.